Evening. Two people to admit. Hi, Jane. Good to see you.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here.
Robert.
I am.
Hi.
Okay, this is the last evening to talk about this particular challenge scenario, what to do with the person you find most difficult. And we move on next week. I'm going to begin. I'm in the middle of page 2, and we might have referred to it, but we're going to be spending a lot of time with Luke 6, but I'm going to go first to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 and following, in which Peter writes, "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness." A nice reminder that the Sermon on the Mount was still holding forth a generation or two later when First Peter's written. The text we're going to spend a lot of time with this evening is Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 36. I believe we actually read it last week, but I'm not going to rely on. I have a 48-hour memory, so I'm not going to assume we all have 168-hour memories. But in Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 17, I'm just setting the context for the text we're going to look at. But Jesus went down with them and stood on a level place, and a huge crowd gathered. And then he begins to tell people something that sounds a lot like the Sermon on the Mount, but not quite. Looking at his disciples, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for that is how their fathers treated the false prophets." And so we briefly mentioned this last week. It's often called the Sermon on the Plain because it begins with Jesus went down and stood on a level place. What's its connection to the Sermon on the Mount? Until I hear otherwise, I'm going to assume that Jesus dealt with a lot of themes over and over and over again. And this is Luke's take on fundamental teachings of Jesus. And the more classic Sermon on the Mount is Matthew's take on it. But the next 10 verses are a lot like Matthew. But in some ways are more intense and clearer to the issue we're talking about tonight. So let's read it again and tell me what you hear and how you respond to what you hear. "But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Oops, you're already in trouble, but he's really just getting started. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Any quick response? We got some tough questions to go into if we don't, but how does that text leave you feeling?
I think for most of us, our in our families and our culture trains us to fight for ourselves, defend ourselves. Don't let anybody get something over on you. Just totally opposite of what this is saying. This is saying be totally vulnerable, and the world keeps telling us take care of yourself, look out for yourself first. Fight.
Yeah. The average person would have to do a lot of rewiring to follow this text in any face value kind of way compared to contemporary cultures, as Debbie says. In terms of how Jesus teaches us as his intended followers to treat the difficult people in our lives. And I suppose what we really mean by that, the people we find it difficult to love, might be a better way of putting it than calling them the difficult people. But verse 27 alone says four things. It says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. And so, that's pretty much it. Not terribly confusing, just like impossible to do, it would seem, at least under current conditioning. But it's pretty clear what the intent is. And then he moves to examples. And so the question I'm asking is, how do we become a person who, when struck on one cheek, which is perhaps the insult that most instinctively arouses retaliation? I mean, a person slaps you on the cheek. It's almost like it feels like you were born with the instinct to slap them back. So how do we become a person who, when struck on one cheek, turns the other cheek as well?
This is odd. I think for me, at least the verses, they're very challenging. And, part of the challenge is statements like, what credit is it to you when you love somebody that loves you? And so that's a challenge. I mean, why wouldn't that be a good thing? But ultimately, what it all boils down to, I believe, at least to me, listening to this, is that you need to go beyond your comfort zone. And so, dealing with the difficult person means you have to go beyond your comfort zone. And getting, slapped in the cheek, as you say, instinctively, you would think that you might intuitively react back. But if you go beyond your comfort zone and exercise some restraint there, and or some a consideration there, that would allow you to turn your cheek.
I think what this is, it suggests too, it's also more than just accepting the slap. You know, it's going another step further, meaning it's not just about not slapping back, accepting and dealing, but it's kind of, okay, how about this side? You know, that seems really hard.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, the funny part is Jesus did all of this, including while dying on the cross.
yeah,
So he's speaking here pretty much almost as foreshadowing as to what he's gonna be doing down the line,
Mhm,
and showing it by his own example,
mhm.
yeah.
that you can do it.
That's for sure. Yeah, if you had any question about whether Jesus is serious about this, it does foreshadow exactly what he's going to end up doing. With a small, there's a little complexity to that, which we'll get to in a moment. But certainly he is the person who is capable of turning the other cheek. Now, I would do better on that one. The next one gets to me even more difficult. Consider how we might become people who even lend to our enemies without expecting to get anything back. Now, it's a little hard to envision the precise circumstance in Jesus' time of what that would be. I mean, are you almost being extorted? Are you being coerced? I mean, the person is identifiable as an enemy. I have an issue of lending to anybody without expecting to get anything back. That alone represents an issue, but now the person who seems to be an enemy, who is out to get you, and they have asked for something, pressed you in some way into giving them money, and you simply give it without. Well, I guess in a way, if it is my enemy, I kind of should be prepared for not getting it back.
Yeah. Dale, I think these are examples of the ultimate power moves, right?
Yeah.
That, you need the power that we would find in the Son of God in order to be able to do it. But ultimately, turning the cheek or any of these things really puts you on a level way above the normal level. And I view it as, and power may be a negative term, but that's the way I see it.
Okay, now clarify that for me, John. What are you calling the ultimate power move?
Well, my ability, say you strike me on the cheek, my ability to control myself enough and offer you the other one is really it takes power to do that, right? It takes, if nothing else, willpower or confidence or maybe bravery. But it's a higher power than simply deploying a swing at somebody else.
Yeah.
It's easy to hit somebody else. It's much harder not to.
Yeah.
Dale, may I ask you, I'm not really sure, but when the idea of giving to your enemy, is it for their blessing or is it for something else? And I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but sometimes overindulgence, they could drown in excess. And so are you giving out of goodness or are you giving out of harshness with the hope that they'll spin out of control as a result?
Yeah.
There's a text that addresses that. I don't know where it is, but the language is along the lines of heaping coals of fire on their heads.
Right.
Anybody know where that text is? I mean, this is a
Don't do that.
perfect example of that. I can kind of get you back really, really good.
Yeah.
Heap
coals of fire on your head by turning the other cheek. And I think that's exactly what John was describing. It can be that. I don't think it necessarily has to be, but it definitely can be. Anybody know where that text is? Heaping coals of fire. Somebody's got a thesaurus in the back of their.
Romans 12.
Romans 12, 20, one place.
There's a New Testament
Say
reference.
again, Julie.
Yeah, we
Romans
read it, we
12.
read it last week in Romans 12,
Romans 12,
14 to 21.
19 to 20.
But is that citing
Yeah.
Proverbs?
Mhm.
Is
It
that
probably is. I mean,
probably?
Yeah, it's more than one place for sure.
Yeah,
But
So-
do we believe that Jesus actually wants that to be the net result? Yeah, turn the other cheek so you can heap some coals on this guy. I don't think so, but that's the way as a human, maybe I would operate.
yeah, on your way to true goodness.
Yeah,
Okay, you know, when I really try to think through the real life circumstances here, I think it might be relatively easy to imagine lending to my enemy and not expecting to get anything back. They are, after all, my enemy. So in some ways, I think the harder thing, I'm gonna share an ethical dilemma of my own. 3 or 4 years ago, I lent a substantial amount of money to someone in our condo units. That person was in a situation where they were caught between a rock and a hard place. Their place was going to be foreclosed. Any number of things might happen. They were over here they were over here as immigrants, and so they were on an H-1B or 2B, I forget which it is, but it was a visa that was restricted to the company they were with, and then the company essentially went under. And it was in the middle of an administration that was making everything almost impossible for immigrants anyway. And so I lent a substantial amount of money. The person, you know, wanted to do the right thing by that and broke and thought he could pay me back in 12 monthly payments. And he was able to make 4 of them, and then his circumstances didn't turn out all that well. And it just sort of slid off. I mean, he explained why the next payment wasn't coming in, and then sort of, we stayed friends, we stayed in touch, but I never really heard. It just dropped out of sight for 2 or 3 years. Every so often I would nudge him a little. Every so often he'd sort of bring it up. But to this point, he's now doing numbers of things with his life that show the ability to make discretionary judgments and how you want to spend that money, and it's not repaying me. His life is still pretty tough for him. Now, during a lot of that time, we've been engaged. This has actually made it more complicated. We've been engaged in largely in email exchanges on philosophical issues, duality, non-duality. I don't know if anyone wants to discuss that as a philosophical issue with you. You should probably run for the hills. You really don't want to get into it, but in a nutshell, it's basically saying that we live in a dualistic world, but ultimate reality is one. And since ultimate reality is one, the judgments we make in our dualistic world are not ultimate. Good and bad are not ultimate, because ultimately it's all one. The ethical distinctions are and it's true to a certain extent that our ethical distinctions are often quite faulty. but he's been taking the high road in a sense that he understands reality better than most people, but he wants to share with poor benighted me his insight. And I try to listen. I've learned quite a bit from him, but ultimately, I'm not buying the whole package. I'm learning some things from
That's
him.
beautiful, Dale, but my question to him would be, where my money?
Okay, that's one view. What, any advice?
Well, let me give you a counter view. Not that I want to debate with Eddie on this, but sometimes I wonder, well, whose money really is it that you're lending? Where did those resources come from? Why were they entrusted to you in the first place? What are you expected to do with them? And I could be totally wrong. But if you're searching for comfort, Dale, if you think of it that way, maybe you'll find a little bit more comfort.
Other views?
I've often used the view that if you loan money to a person, don't expect it back,
Yeah.
It's
and
the
just
risk of-
move on from
Yeah,
there.
it's the risk of loaning somebody money to some extent.
Oh, what now?
It's the risk of loaning money.
Yeah,
Get it back.
yeah.
And so you have to take that risk into account and kind of expect that that's a very likely outcome.
That's true, but he did not, and this is my perspective, he did not ask for the money, he asked to be loaned the money. And to just tell him at this point, don't worry about it, it's fine, is disrespecting of his intention to pay it back. And I think having some communicating some level of there's an expectation to pay back actually honors him as a capable and responsible person. That I have that expectation of him.
Mhm.
Not that Debbie and I have been discussing this much in our home.
For several years.
Well, the thing that complicates it to me, and I would sort of read Eddie's mind that this is perhaps why he flared, is he's claiming the higher spiritual ground, the whole way.
Mhm.
Without referencing. the money.
Without referencing the money, but he is higher spiritual insight. And of course, one of the things while we're having all those discussions, I'm thinking, wow, that's a really convenient spirituality. It doesn't really matter if you pay or don't pay, does it?
You should do to him what Nathan did to David, give him an example and then tell him you are the man.
Yeah. There you go. There you go. Okay, it's tough stuff.
Let me tell you something about money. It makes people do what they don't want to do. That's the bottom line.
Okay.
Say that again, Art.
Whether it's killing or whether it's robbing or whether it's ripping someone off or whatever.
Yeah,
It just
That's
makes
true.
you do what you don't want to do.
yeah. It gets messy.
Well, in all seriousness, if I'm in that situation where I'm been cheated or treated unfairly, I have to do a full accounting of what has come into my life monetarily and what's gone out of my life. And if I do that, I know that I'm way ahead.
Yes, yes, that too.
When you do the full accounting, when you count all the blessings.
I've had the thought often that in my to write off that kind of money as benevolence in an immigration case in a country that had only marginal interest in taking care of immigrants and that, okay, the country has treated you quite inhospitably, and I can treat you hospitably. You know, that's a thought that often occurs to me. I think if we weren't having this discussion on his spiritual high road,
Mhm,
the way forward would be quite clear to me.
mhm.
You know, forgive the loan. But
Dale, I'm sorry, because it just seems like it's worth at least telling him that you're forgiving the loan. I mean, I don't know if you've really stated that, so that he can own that a bit, you know, because it sounds like he doesn't expect to have to pay it back.
oh,
You know,
no,
and
no,
maybe
he it's quite clear to him because I've actually called him on his spiritual high road. Because, well, it's a little more, we've been through a few rounds on another game we play is him saying, oh, okay, you know, I'll pay you back, I'll sell my car. And I'm going, and so one of the things I had to say to him is, you know, don't put me in the position of feeling guilty for tough choices you may have to make. You know, that's up, you know, that, you know, don't sell your car, you know, but so it's pretty clear to him that I expect it back. It's clearer to him that I expect it back than that I actually do expect it back. Do you follow what I'm saying there? I mean, I probably in some ways don't expect it back now and may well tell him that. But at this point, he was Debbie's still over there glowering.
I'm laughing. I'm not glowering.
Oh, put it in words.
No, I just feel like he's said he wants to pay it back and you don't undo it.
Okay, so it's complicated. Okay, changing the subject on this text, but the issue being the same, still loving your enemies, doing good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. What do we learn? How do we learn to picture God from this passage? What is the picture of God that Jesus presents here?
It's in verse 35, it says, the Most High, because he's kind to ungrateful and wicked.
It's an
So,
extraordinary
Pretty much
picture.
are showing kindness
Yeah,
when the other person doesn't deserve it.
yeah, unconditional kindness. That's the picture. That is the picture of God. And I want to make sure we don't leave a text like this without noticing that for all the ways organized Christianity or various people may have presented God as angry, as judgmental, as out to get us, God with a hair-trigger temper, that is not the picture that this text is presenting.
He's not angry despite the number of times we've let him down.
Exactly. Okay, so what are the reasons that Jesus gives in this text for loving our enemies? Well, one of them is so that you actually will be representative of the God who takes care of you. You know, what are other reasons? And I look at it and say, well, here, I'm not sure Jesus gives a few of the reasons I'm thinking of, but when I think through this text, some reasons that come up to me, the wasted energy otherwise, all the energy we put into maintaining conflictual relationships. And it's enormous, in many cases, enormous amount of emotional energy that that could have been spent much more productively in other ways. But I think what's fundamental to what Jesus is talking about is what else breaks the cycle of violence other than extraordinary graciousness. extraordinary generosity, turning the other cheek. Otherwise, the violence just goes on and accelerates. The headlines more recently tell us about that. And I'm not trying to take, I don't know what I would do. I actually do know what I would do. I just don't know that I would be completely correct. But I am going to cite another case of another case. It was an essay in the New York Times a week or two ago. I think it was Christoph, yeah, who's saying, here's something India got right. And he cites a case from the middle of the first decade, the 2005, 2006, something like that, where Pakistani-backed terrorists killed several hundred people in Kashmir. And the Indian government, which was a different administration than they have now, clearly, but the government they had back in those years made the decision in terms of how they would respond to that, to do nothing. They let it stand. I mean, they did some police action in terms of protecting people up there then, but they did not retaliate. And the point that Christoph was making was that kept the entire focus of the world on Pakistani-backed terrorists. And that's exactly that is a successful outcome. I mean, it doesn't make sense to begin with. It turns out to be marvelously effective. That from then on, it was very clear in that exchange who the bad guys were and who the good guys were. And it kept on, India could have gone in and risked nuclear risks because they're both nuclear powers. But India simply chose to express their disapproval, take care of their people, and drop the subject. And so what else breaks the cycle of violence is a critical point here. What else works? And what all is at stake in all of this? These are all issues that have to be dealt with when you're dealing with a difficult person. I mean, okay, you want to contest them, what's at stake? What are we just responding in kind? What's the opportunity for breaking the cycle here? Julie?
I was just going to say, and this really goes back to what I heard John say in terms of the power. I mean, to some extent, even Jesus says, "They don't take my life; I lay it down."
Right.
So that's where you actually have power in the situation by laying it down and not letting it be taken.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I think you're talking about in that case. In any, I don't retaliate and I gain everything. So I think there is you accomplish that, taking you don't lay it, you don't get it taken, you lay it down.
Yeah.
You ask for alternative of that, right? That would end things.
Yeah.
It just brought back into memory how World War II ended, with United States, doing the final thing that they did was very violent, the bombs, but it ended everything.
Well, and I also,
it was very unfortunate. A lot of people died. To this day, there are effects.
and
but
still some debates on
exactly that, but it ended. Like if you're just thinking about ending things, that's also another one. Is like you put down the best power move, and you're like, nobody can top me at this point. So you better end things.
Yeah, but I also go on there. You're correct on that, but I also go on there to consider how the United States responded after the war, which was things like the Marshall Plans and seeing that Germany and Japan quickly recovered their economies and so on. And that set up a much more stable world in the Western sector by virtue of doing that. And then you consider how World War I ended, which was with massive reparations demanded of Germany, both England and France basically demanding their tons of flesh, huge war payments that savaged the German economy and did what? Made Hitler all but inevitable. And so how you respond to violence gets very critical, and there's room for a lot of creativity, and there's actually room for mastering some of the skills of love here. And it often turns out, in spite of counterintuitively, it often turns out to be a huge advantage. Few more questions though here, and this next one I think is a factor. What does knowing the historical moment or context that draws out these teachings contribute to your understanding of the principles involved here? Now, here's what I'm going to remind us of. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus's teaching to an occupied country on the edge of revolt. I mean, Jesus, we just take it as teachings that are absolutely universal and almost contextless. These teachings actually have a context too. Which is he's talking to his own people on the eve of destruction. He knows the spirit of his people. He knows how insurrectionists they are. He knows revolt is in the air. He knows it will turn bad. And 40 years later, it does exactly what he knows it's going to do. They rise in revolt. Rome crushes them, basically flattens the city of Jerusalem. He knows all that, and so that has to be factored in here too. That he's giving instructions that are particularly relevant when the power differential is enormously against you. That you turn the other cheek. The case where that gets really clear is when someone asks you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, back from the Matthew account. And that's a very clear case of a Roman soldier coming along to a Galilean farmer and demanding that he carry his baggage 1 mile. And it was an agreed upon distance. That's how they carried a lot of their baggage taken care of. But it was always resentful because the farmer was out in the field trying to get a crop in and trying to beat the weather and whatever all else. But it's clearly the scenario is occupation and overwhelming power differential. And so what makes for peace there might really be in your interest, as opposed to having your country destroyed. I also think context matters here too. And Jane.
Yeah, I just want to comment. Walter Wink, a New Testament scholar who's been dead for a few years now, but he made a very salient, I thought, very salient argument about these stories of turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, give him your cloak also, as not as acts of submission, but as acts of subversion. That by not only accepting the poor treatment, you say, because he went into some really long, complicated arguments about how if you hit someone with one hand, it's has implications of two equals going at it. But if you turn the other cheek, then your attacker is forced to kind of give you the back of his hand. And it's, you know, it's not then a conflict between equals, it's between unequals, but it takes on that connotation of power and powerlessness, and that the real power is in the powerlessness. I mean, he's drawing a lot on the work of King and others 20 or more years ago. But I particularly like that one about giving him, you know, if he demands your cloak, then give him your tunic. And where does that leave you? Standing in the middle of the road, buck naked, because there were no underclothes in those days. And so it becomes very humiliating for the person in power who has demanded of you this, you know, I mean, this very modest thing. It's just a take on those stories that I think, his name is Walter Wink. I forget the name of Naming the Powers, it might be the name of the book. Right. But I think he kind of has something there in terms of, in letting go of our own struggle to be powerful, we can in fact find a power, you know, a higher power, a greater power than what we would bring as persons. I wish I could tell you exactly where that is, because it's a fun.
No, it's the main point is what counts here, and you made it very well. And I, you know, I think between what John said earlier this evening and what you're saying, that it's not strictly submission, there's a kind of subversion to doing the gracious thing. It certainly is what breaks the cycle. It's not what is expected, and so okay. Another way of looking at this is something that Miroslav Volf, who is another great thinker on this. Miroslav Volf is a professor of theology at Yale University. But he also is Croatian, and so early in his life, in his young adulthood, that's when Serbia was violating Croatia and Bosnia in various ways, and so Volf gave a lot of thought to, out of that context, knowing that his own people had almost, you know, concentration camps, massacres, enormous destruction done to them, comes up with the concept of disciples of Jesus being willing to embrace the evil other, willing to embrace the evil other, and that has stuck with me. And the point that he's making is this, that we cannot even get to justice and truth until we inquire the willingness to embrace the evil other. We ourselves do not get to justice and truth, that we cannot discern justice and we cannot speak truthfully. When we have a single-minded pursuit of our justice, we forget what justice is on our side. And that happens over and over and over again. So he's saying, in our single-minded pursuit of a certain truth, we may fail to see many other truths. And I found that to be a very helpful concept. The other thing that I think is important to remember here when we're talking about loving our enemies means becoming aware of whom we are enemies to. You know, and so we think, well, I'm not really an enemy to anybody as far as I know. Well, as far as I know. I mean, when you think about Jesus' teaching, you know, it's the parable of the Good Samaritan, and it's he's basically saying, but to whom are you? Not who is your neighbor, who are you the good neighbor to? That's really the question. Well, it's the same question with regard to enemies, that loving our enemies means becoming aware of whom we are enemies to. I mean, in our indifference and in the high living standards which we enjoy and appreciate in most cases, we give very little thought to how all that came to be. Eddie, John, one or the other of you basically made that kind of point earlier. How did you come to having the money that made it possible to do that? Well, those are the questions that need to be asked. Whose life and livelihood are you putting at risk, or am I putting at risk? Well, I don't intend to be doing that to anybody, but it doesn't mean I'm not. I mean, because I'm not giving any thought to it doesn't mean that I'm not doing it. Who am I out to get? You know, I become fairly quickly aware of who it seems to me might be out to get me, but I'm doing a little muttering over on my side of the border too, right? And now I usually don't turn it into viciousness, but who am I out to get?
Well, what you've done is you've actually amalgamated what John said and I said. Okay. It's beyond just this sum of money.
Yeah.
But you're looking at the greater context.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the greater accounting. He's talking about, you know, the generosity of the universe and how that money was to just pass through you and not stop with you. And for whatever reason, you know, you accept that and just kind of know that just the sum of money and that it came from you is not the only thing.
Yeah.
You know, what does that mean? How's that helping somebody? If, you know, if you take that money from him in repayment, what is that doing in his life? Because, you know, all of that has a utility and a purpose or whatever. And so once you can think outside of yourself, to a larger picture, being slapped or cheated or whatever, and know that there's a greater story that our lives are about, then it makes it a little bit easier to live through that, knowing that there's a greater picture here.
Yeah. And as John said, that might help you on your way to comfort and peace to think through some of that. Whose rights am I violating? And I don't give that much thought, but there may be some. Okay, so we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and how these units always end is, which lessons do you want to keep in mind? Will you keep in mind most for learning to love the really difficult person? So, and so you might think back through the sheets, scan the sheets, any notes you've made, taken, filed away in your mind or whatever. What are the takeaways from this? One of the things I would say, that even in issues like this, context does matter. Jesus is a context of what he's saying here. When he's confronted in one of the night trials before his crucifixion, when one of the servants of the high priest slaps him, he doesn't exactly turn the other cheek. He doesn't plow him back either, but he kind of contests the rightness of doing that. You know, why did you strike me? What is your, you know, What's your point? I mean, where did you get the authority to do that? So it's not that even teachings like this are contextless. The situations we're talking about matter. You know, who this difficult person is and what that context is matters. You won't do the same thing in every case. The question I've raised last week in terms of the mixed signals you get in scripture. Remember, scripture says in one case, warn the divisive person, warn them a second time, and then have nothing to do with them. I mean, that, you know, that's over against love your enemies. The divisive person is the most difficult person you're going to run into. And when the writer Titus is taking that case on, he says, warn them once, warn them twice, and get them out of your life. The context is what matters. And for me, the question I'm always looking for when I'm trying to figure out how do I read the mixed signals here and how do I pull them all together is what most likely promotes things like love, joy, and peace. What most likely promotes it in the big picture here? Love, joy, and peace, or the other spiritual gifts. But there'll be different answers. There'll be different responses you'll make based on that question, because in different situations it will be different things. What other things do you remember that you want to take with you from this unit?
I want to say one more thing, Dale, and you know, as we're studying these different scenarios and how we would respond and why we would respond the way we do, we mentioned probably 20 minutes ago, well, what about God? You know, how many times does he turn the other cheek for me, right? Or for you or anybody else on the screen? And not a one of us said he did it because he was being subversive. Everyone on the screen knows God behaves that way because he loves us.
Yeah.
That's to me the overarching
Good
way. I don't know how he does. I can't figure him out. I'm certainly not capable of that kind of love, but that's what we conclude about our maker. I think that's pretty good. We're lucky. We're lucky to be able to draw that conclusion.
Great point. One of the things I remember as sort of a motto in my life it's an ideal to which I want to live up to, which is extending to others the grace you know you need yourself.
But you got to get to that point, Dale.
Yeah.
You got to get to that point that you need, you need the grace.
Yeah.
That's self-awareness.
Yeah. And so it's extending to others the grace that God has given you, but then extending to others the grace that essentially is the same thing, extending to others the grace that you need yourself. And I'm fairly good at recognizing the grace I need. I don't always see it for sure, but I'm better at recognizing that than recognizing the grace I need to extend to someone else. They're the same thing. Any other final comment?
I think at the end of the day, the balance is, like you said, knowing the situation and making sure there is a fine line between letting someone take advantage of you and showing love to your enemy.
Yeah.
When I was in Louisiana a month ago, I did something for my brother. Not a big deal, but he thought it was a big deal. And so I flew down, I paid for it and stuff like that. I took my family out, but I gave him something. And he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said something like, "My goal in life is to treat my family the way I treat my friends." He had no argument and he accepted it. Now, that's not God, but that's about as close as I can get to how God loves me by doing it towards someone else.
Yeah. Okay, everyone, thank you. Next week we move on.
Thanks.
Thank you
Gail.
very much.
Great,
Have a good
everybody.
evening.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Did.